Hello everyone, my name is Marla and I'm the owner and creator behind From Rust to Roses Vintage. I started my business about a year ago, but I have always had a love for vintage and antique items, the old, the forgotten, the rusty crusty. As part of my business, I now take those items, upcycle them, and turn them into beautiful home decor. If this sounds like something you'd be interested in, then stick around. Thank you. For my first project, I chose this gold frame that I had thrifted at Goodwill. I loved how ornate it was on the front and thought it would be a beautiful addition to my booth. I decided to upcycle it using Bellwood, a beautiful soft sage green color by Fusion Mineral Paint. I cleaned the frame thoroughly before painting it, however, I did not apply any type of sealer or shellac. Fusion Mineral Paint is made with a built-in primer and top coat. Once I had the frame painted, I chose a decoupage paper that I thought would look good with that color. I used my fingers to size it around the canvas and then cut it out. I decided that I didn't want the canvas to be stark white behind the picture, as I wanted the picture to look more vintage when I was finished. So I took out Cathedral Taupe, another Fusion Mineral Paint, and used it to paint the canvas. Then I used an IOD distressed stamp and decided to put some distress marks on top of the canvas before applying the decoupage paper. I just pressed down lightly, and although it may be difficult to see in the video, you will be able to see it beneath the decoupage paper when the project is finished. I used a heat gun to seal the ink before I applied any decoupage medium. I didn't want to run the risk that the decoupage medium would smear the ink beneath the paper. Once it was dry, I went back to the decoupage paper. I always spritz my paper with water to make it easier to work with, and I laid down a starter strip of decoupage medium. In this case, I'm using Pentart's decoupage glue and varnish. I always like to add an additional amount of decoupage medium to the corners, especially when working on a canvas, because they have a tendency to curl up as they dry. I continued with this process, working my way down to the bottom of the canvas. I used my brush to lay it down flat. The paper went down perfectly with no wrinkles or air bubbles showing. Once the paper was completely down, I went over the top with one more layer of the decoupage medium. After the paper had dried thoroughly, I sanded off the excess with 220 grit sandpaper. I decided not to use the glass. As a final step, I went over the paper with a triple thick gel to give it a nice glossy finish. Because I wanted a very Victorian look to this picture, I went over the raised areas with vintage gold rub and buff. I also decided I would add a touch to the inner and outer edges of the frame. To bring out all the details in the frame and to give it a more vintage look, I finished it with a coat of Fusion's antiquing gel. I applied it with a brush and then used a soft cloth to wipe back any excess, continuing this process until I got the exact look that I was going for. After the frame dried, I put the picture and frame together, and I think the results are beautiful. Please let me know what you think in the comments. Project 2, I used a tray that I had upcycled about a year and a half ago. It was kind of a grungy off-white with decoupage paper, but I decided I didn't like it. So I painted over the decoupage paper and then used Bellwood by Fusion Mineral Paint to paint the tray itself. After it was painted, I found a decoupage paper that I love with mushrooms and butterflies and plants, and decided I would use it at the bottom of the tray. Because I like a more organic look, I used water to tear away the edges of the decoupage paper. I repeated the same process I had used before to decoupage the paper for the picture. I created a starter strip by laying down some of the decoupage medium and then spritzing the back of my paper with water before placing it over the medium and smoothing it down. The paper I'm using here is a rice paper, which is really nice because it has some stability to it and it will allow you to move it around without tearing until you get it just where you want it. Continued with the process until I had the entire piece of decoupage paper placed down. After the paper was completely smoothed out, I went over it with an additional coat of decoupage medium. As you could probably tell, the decoupage paper wasn't quite big enough to fill up the entire tray. So this is when I had to attempt to use my blending skills to blend the paper in to the rest of the bottom of the tray. Those two colors that I thought I could mix together and attempt to match the background of the decoupage paper. Along the edges, I started to apply the mixture using a stippling motion. I continued blending until I had worked my way around the entire piece of decoupage paper. In order to prevent the paint from getting on the sides of the tray, I went around the other three edges with blue painter's tape so I could get right up to where the bottom met the edge. Once I was happy with the results, I got out DIY's liquid patina and gave the bottom of the tray a good coat. I then decided to do some distressing by using the liquid patina and DIY's dark and decrepit dust all around the edges of the tray. I used a wet wipe to remove excess dust and blend it towards the center of the tray. I decided to try distressing the tray itself by mixing DIY crystal clear liquid patina with some of the dark and decrepit liquid patina. I brushed the mixture all over the sides of the tray as well as the handles. Unfortunately, when I was finished doing this, I was not happy with the results that I got. I felt that it was far too dark and distressed. So I decided to take some of the Bellwood paint and mix it with Debbie's DIY liquid patina and make sort of a glaze to put over the top of the dark and decrepit. I chose to make a glaze because I did want some of the distressing to show through. I did not want it to be back to a solid Bellwood color.
I know it did you wrong, wish I could take your pain away, 'cause I hate seeing tears streaming down your face. I know you're strong.
Once the glaze had dried, I went over the entire tray with Debbie's DIY wax in clear. If I know that I'm going to use dark wax on something, I always start with a coat of clear wax because it creates sort of a barrier between my project and the wax. This will allow me to wipe back any excess dark wax that I don't want on my project. After buffing off the clear wax with a soft towel, I came in with a layer of DIY's dark wax. You might be asking yourself why I would bother with this step after going to all the trouble of making a glaze to tone down the dark and decrepit, and it's because the dark wax gave me a much softer finish, and in the end I was much happier with the results. Once again, please let me know what you think in the comments. For project 3, I decided to do another frame. I found this one at the Goodwill. I think it was only $1.99. I used this handy little tool I picked up at the dollar store to get the stickers off, and then I take the frames apart. I wiped this frame down with a wet wipe and then got out my acorns and oak leaves mold from IOD. Instead of using paper clay, I decided to use amazing casting resin because this will set up in about 10 minutes. You mix together equal parts of part A, part B, stir it for about 30 seconds, and then get ready to pour because it sets up very quickly. As I was pouring into the molds, I was paying too much attention to the tiny stems, and as you'll see, I overpoured one of the leaves. I hate wasting product, but I knew that it would be easy to peel away the excess resin once I unmolded the leaves. I started cleaning up a little bit of the resin with a popsicle stick, and I left this part of the video in so you can see how quickly that resin sets up. When the pieces were ready to unmold, I took them out and started playing around with positioning them on the frame. I wasn't sure how many I was going to use, and in the end, I only used a few. So now I have extras for another fall project.
Just let it out, I'm by your side now. Just hold on a bit more, 'cause I know you only see the rain, not the rainbow. Deep down
Once I had positioned the molds where I wanted them, I got out my Titebond Quick and Thick and applied a generous layer to the back of the molds to glue them onto the corners of my picture frame.
I know you'll get up again. Better stand up tall, I know you can be brave, brave, brave. I know you can be brave, brave, brave.
I decided the leaves on the left needed an acorn as well, so I took one of the smaller molds and glued it on top of the leaves.
I know you're strong, won't feel this way for long, no. If you wanna go out, we can go out. We can hide away just for one night. But if you wanna cry, just
Once I had the molds on, I made sure I went back and cleaned up any excess glue that had squeezed out underneath them. After the molds were set, I took out Fusion Mineral Paint in the color Woodwick and went over the frame and the molds with 2 good coats.
hold on a bit more, 'cause I know you only see the rain, not the rainbow. I know you'll get up again. Better stand up tall, I know you can be brave, 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 brave. I know you can be brave, 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 brave. If you wanna go out, we can go out. Brave, brave, brave. We can hide away just for
While the frame and the molds were drying, I took out the decoupage paper I had chosen for this project and decoupaged it onto an artist canvas. I used the same method I had used before, utilizing a starter strip and then working my way down to the bottom of the paper. I gave it a final coat of DIY liquid patina. In my last video, I painted some green floral leaves to make them look like fall leaves, so I decided I wanted to do the same thing with these molds. I used DIY paints in Summer Crush, Queen Bee, and then the Fusion mineral paint in Woodwick. Towards the end, I decided to get out some of the DIY Cherry Picked, which is a beautiful maroon color, and do the edges of the leaves. To finish off the picture, I used 220 grit sandpaper on my finger sander and sanded off the excess paper. I then decided again to do a little distressing around the edges. As I mentioned before, I really do like things that are old, vintage, kind of on the rusty, crusty side.
If you wanna talk, I'm right here, not gonna leave your side. Just feel free to open up when the moment's right. Across your face, it is written across your face. If you wanna go out, we can go out. You can hide away just for one night.
After I was done, I gave it a good coat of DIY Big Top. Big Top is a durable top coat that will leave a little bit of a sheen on your final project when you are not looking for a matte finish. To finish off the frame, I went over the frame and the molds with a mixture of DIY liquid patina in clear and DIY dark and decrepit patina. As my hand moves away from the frame, you can see the difference it makes in the color of the leaves and the frame. I am so happy with the final project. I think it turned out amazing, and I'm so excited for fall. It's my favorite time of year. For my fourth and final project, I took this little box that I picked up at Goodwill or Salvation Army, I don't remember where. I like wood, but I wasn't really sure what it was made for. Kind of looks like a recipe box to me, however there was no lid. I decided that it would be the perfect project for some milk paint. So I took it outside and gave it 2 coats of shellac, because the shellac will help the milk paint adhere to the wood. And then I mixed up several different shades of green in milk paint that I had available. Green is my favorite color, and I really like the old-timey country type of green. And so I just kept mixing powders until I came up with a color that I thought I would like. When you're mixing milk paint, it's very important that you stir it thoroughly. It's almost impossible to get all the lumps out of it unless you use maybe a small blender. But once you mix it, you need to let it set for about 10 minutes before you use it. I had a feeling it was going to take at least 2 coats of milk paint to cover this, so I started out with a relatively thin layer and covered the entire box with it.
Like a fairy tale. If I will share my life with anyone, I really hope that you will be the one. But now I wonder what is wrong, what's on your troubled mind.
Once I was finished painting the box, I got out my heat gun to try and encourage the paint to crackle or chip. And it looks like I did get some cracking on the first coat of paint. I went over the first coat with a second coat of milk paint, and then used my heat gun a second time to continue to encourage some crackling. In order to give the box a little something extra, I got out my letterpress stamps. These are made by IOD, and decided I was going to stamp the word vintage across the front of the box. IOD makes a carrier sheet that has grid lines on it, so it makes it very easy to ensure that your stamps are lined up properly. Once I had the letters placed in a straight line, I checked it out to make sure it was going to fit on the box. And then I took out my IOD black ink pad and inked up the letters. When you're ready to lay down the stamp, it's important that you do not wiggle it around. I usually put one hand down to hold it and then use the fingers on my other hand to gently go over the stamps until I feel like I have covered all my bases before lifting the stamp up. I always have a wet wipe next to me when I'm using the stamps, because even though the ink is permanent, if you make a mistake and you can get to it very quickly, there's a good chance that you'll be able to wipe the ink off and start over. Luckily, I liked the way this turned out the first time, so I didn't have to do that. I used my heat gun to set the ink so that when I applied the final finishes, it wouldn't smear. As you've probably noticed by now, I do like things to look old and time-worn, so I got out my finger sander and began to sand some of the milk paint off of the edges of the box where they would naturally be worn by use over time. Once I had all of the sanding done, I got out my Sweet Pickins dark oil wax and applied a generous coat to the entire box. Notice how the color changes once you put that oil wax on there. It's amazing. After you've given the oil wax time to soak in, go back with a soft cloth and wipe off any excess. Even though the oil wax was beautiful, the box still wasn't distressed enough for me. So I used several products to get it to the point I liked. I used some Van Dyke antiquing wax, as well as some of Debbie's DIY decrepit dust. I'll let you watch while I finish distressing the box. I think it turned out fabulous. The crackle I achieved was so beautiful, and I love its old vintage look. If you would like to see more upcycles like this, please consider subscribing to my channel and check out both my Facebook and Instagram pages. Thank you so much for spending part of your day with me. In the meantime, keep an eye out for my next video.